Brooklyn Independent Television.
When you go shopping in Brooklyn, or anywhere in New York City for that matter, are you noticing more and more chain stores? The phenomenon isn't occurring in every neighborhood, but according to the Center for an Urban Future, overall the city now has more than 300 national retailers, represented by a total of 6,700 stores. The borough with the greatest percentage rise in national chain stores? Brooklyn, with more than 1,300, up 5.3% from 2009. For example, the 11201 zip code, downtown Brooklyn and Brooklyn Heights, is ranked number 11 in the entire city, with 126 chain stores. Flatlands, by the way, is tops in Brooklyn with 146, while areas like Greenpoint and Bed-Stuy have very few. The number one national chain in New York City is Dunkin' Donuts, in first place now for the past few years. Subway is second on the list, having added 28 outlets in the past year. Starbucks is in third place, followed closely by Duane Reade. Rounding out the top five is a corporation a lot of people might expect to see on top, McDonald's. So what does this all mean for the Brooklyn economy as a whole, the national chains, and the small businesses that have to compete with them? With me to tell us more about their latest annual survey is Jonathan Bowles, Director of a Center for an Urban Future. And also here to help us put this all into context is Carl Hum, President and CEO of the Bklyn Chamber of Commerce. Gentlemen, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Good to be here.
Jonathan, let's start by defining what is a chain store, and in particular, how do we distinguish between chain stores and big box retail?
Well, for the purpose of our study, we really looked at what we called national retailers. And for us, that was any major retail store that has more than 2 or 3 outlets that also has a national presence. So distinctly different from just a New York City retailer. And so that can include anything from a major company based elsewhere, like a Target or a Home Depot that has branches in New York, or it can be a New York City store that has locations elsewhere, like a Jimmy Jazz. And so we started looking at this over a couple of years ago because there's been so much attention on whether there's been an explosion of national chains, whether small businesses and mom and pops are really getting pushed out in the city. And there really is a distinction, I think, between kind of just your average national chain, which can include very small footprint stores like a Dunkin' Donuts or a Subway, and some of the larger footprint big boxes, which are more like a Target or a Home Depot. And I think the main distinction is that those companies really take up a huge amount of space. Their whole model is built on having at least 10, 15,000, 20,000 square feet or more of space for their location.
So is it also important to sort of distinguish between national chains that are sort of franchise models versus those that are managed by a sort of corporate entity from elsewhere?
I think it is an important distinction. I mean, it's kind of interesting to us that the top 2 chains in New York City and in Brooklyn, Dunkin' Donuts and Subway, are both franchise models. And there's been growth in those stores, but the growth is that small entrepreneurs, Brooklyn-based, New York City-based entrepreneurs have been starting those businesses. I think that's very different than a Target or a Home Depot, where a lot more of the money is getting siphoned out of the city. For when it's a small business that's based here, an entrepreneur based here, I think that's probably better for New York City. But it's still a national retailer, and I think when you talk about 300 or 400 Dunkin' Donuts in the city, I think it's still something that New Yorkers need to know about.
Well, let's see. So we're talking roughly 1,300 national retailers are represented here in Brooklyn. Out of how many businesses, and does it really matter? Is that a large percentage? Is it a small percentage?
It's still a small percentage. In fact, when we crunched the numbers looking at kind of the number of national retailers by borough per 100 residents in each borough, Brooklyn had the smallest share. I think there's tens of thousands of retailers overall in Brooklyn, and while there's been a clear increase in national retailers, and not just this year, but for several years running, I think that this is still a borough and still a city of independent businesses. In the last year or two, even as national retailers have expanded, we've also seen an increase in independent businesses in a lot of neighborhoods throughout the borough, places like the South Slope, Sunset Park, Sheepshead Bay, and so many other parts of the borough. So for some people, I think that they want the extra choice that these national retailers offered. And I think to some extent the chains are coming in more now than ever before because this hadn't happened previously. That, in some ways Brooklyn and a lot of the boroughs outside of Manhattan were under-retailed when it comes to these national retailers. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but I think a lot of national retailers just didn't come to New York for a while. They didn't think they could make it here, and that's changed. They've seen models of success, and they're coming here more and more.
Well, that's a very good point. And Carl, I remember we used to talk quite a bit when I was at the Bklyn Chamber about Brooklyn being under-retailed. Is that still the case?
The study that you bring up was done back in 2006, where it was discovered that with regards to commercial square feet per capita, Brooklyn had 6 square feet per capita, while the national average is actually 22. We haven't done a follow-up study with regards to that in terms of updating the numbers, but I still think that the prevailing sense is that yes, Brooklyn is still under-retailed, and there still really is plenty of room with regards to having both national chains, retail chains, and also your smaller independent businesses in the borough.
So Carl, are the national retailers represented amongst your membership?
They are. They are. The national retailers are represented as long as the franchisees that Jonathan mentioned about. Jonathan makes a point with regards to some of these franchisees are entrepreneurs, and certainly, among our membership, we have a couple of folks that were able to open a Subway shop or a Dunkin' Donuts, and because of the success that they've had with those franchises, were able to open other stores, other independent stores, under their leadership.
But what is some of the downside to this proliferation?
I think some of the downside is obviously, when you're talking about especially a national chain, their bargaining power, let's say, is going to be a lot greater when it comes to negotiating rents, supplier diversity. There are a couple of downsides there because obviously they're going to have a lot more leverage than, let's say, a smaller mom and pop will. And then also with regards to supplier issues, a lot of the franchises already have predetermined supplier chains. So, they need to buy their flour, their ingredients and whatnot from X corporation out of Indiana, just for example, because that's what the corporation needs. And their ability to make decisions to source locally are a little more hamstrung. So that's a bit of the downside. But again, we have to point to the fact that a lot of these chains are franchises and do offer entrepreneurs and small business owners an opportunity to enter into the small business world, usually at a lower cost, and also with a built-in marketing campaign already there.
I think one of the other potential problems is New York and Brooklyn, really all of the city has made its prize based on being a place of independent business. I think that so many New Yorkers really love the fact that there are unique businesses that you can't find anywhere else, that we're not just a mall. And I think that some New Yorkers are concerned that the balance has tipped a little bit towards more of these national retailers. And I've been asked a lot about this. We've done this study for 3 years now, and I think that there's a real mixed picture. I think that you could argue with the stats that we've shown that there are probably some neighborhoods in the city that have reached a tipping point, that have seen so many new national chains go in that they really have crowded or pushed out some of the great independent businesses of New York. But I clearly don't think that's a citywide problem. And I think that much of Brooklyn, for instance, is not oversaturated with chains. I think that there are very few neighborhoods in this borough that have kind of a significant number of national chains. It's still very much a borough of independent businesses. And I think that we should really pay attention to this and make sure we can do what we can to help independent businesses in this city and in this borough compete. But I think a lot of Brooklynites and a lot of New Yorkers want the shopping choice that so many other Americans have. I think in some cases, like at Target, they want the discounts. There's a lot of poor and working poor and middle class New Yorkers that want the chance to get things at a bargain. So, I think it's a real mixed picture, and there's not really a citywide problem right now.
I'll even add to that, like in some instances, I think there was a lot of consternation when something like a Costco came into Brooklyn. And I think that, not many years removed from it, actually a lot of small business owners that I know, particularly, let's say, restaurant owners or whatever it may be, actually use Costco to supply their own businesses. So in essence, they are part of the supply chain, also part of the local fabric as well. And I think what also needs to be pointed out is that Brooklyn and New York City as a whole has been the birthplace of many institutions that are now considered chains. So let's say, take for example, a P.C. Richards started out in Bensonhurst, Nathan's, and let's say the newer entries, let's say a Brooklyn Industries, which is now going national. These are all homegrown businesses. Jimmy Jazz is also another homegrown business that we should be quite proud of.
I think that we should really be supporting that. I mean, I think that's great. I mean, I think there was once a time when New York was much more of a net exporter of retailers. Bloomingdale's, Macy's, Lord & Taylor. A lot of these major national stores got their start in New York City, not to mention Nathan's and so many others. And I think in recent years it's been the opposite, where national chains from elsewhere are coming into New York. And I think I'd love to get to the point where we're supporting small businesses that start here and grow here and help them get to the point where they can become national. I think that's going to be a good thing for New York.
Yeah, I would add Connecticut Muffin and Uncle Louie G's maybe next on the horizon to become a
area kids.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. So let's talk a little bit about big box though, and the sort of distinction between big box retail versus national retailers that are franchised, that are opportunities for small business entrepreneurs and the like. What's some of the concerns here?
Well, I think one thing is that it takes up so much space. So once you have a big box, if they end up doing badly and the store goes out of business, you've got a big box there and it's harder to fill. And a lot of times landlords, they take 2 or 3 or 4 storefronts to make room for a big box retailer, and that leaves less space available for a small independent business, which generally requires very little space for their retail storefront. The other thing is that they're so big, they have so much scale, they can offer lower prices, and it really does squeeze out a lot of mom and pops that are in direct competition.
And I'm sorry, but what's wrong with that, Carl? Where is the consumer voice in all this? I mean, we usually hear from the unions, we usually hear from elected officials, but...
Sure, I think the consumer voice is clearly heard, the fact that these stores are being established and are doing well. I mean, I don't think it's a secret that the Brooklyn branch of IKEA is actually the most successful in all the world. So the consumer voice is clearly heard there, and there's a reason why there is 400 plus Dunkin' Donuts in the borough, because pardon the pun, there's an appetite for Dunkin' Donuts in the borough, and if there wasn't, then certainly from a corporate standpoint they would scale back on it. I think the point that Jonathan makes in terms of some of these larger retailers being able to offer lower prices, I mean, it cuts both ways, obviously, right? I mean, on the one hand, it certainly is advantageous for some families here, who are not making as much money as some other folks, and certainly, going to a Target or going to a Costco is going to save them a lot of money. But then on the other side, some of the products that these retailers may be offering are the same products that some of the smaller mom and pops independent businesses may be offering. And there is a national movement called 350 Project, and I think that the Chamber has featured this group before in some of our seminars, is that it's not so much the us versus them attitude that 350 Project has, it's that the playing field is large enough that we can all be here. It's just basically about being smart about how you offer your products. And I think that we've heard all over with regards to how mom and pops can be competitive. It's on their service side. It's on ordering niche products. It is really sort of sharpening their skills as a retailer. And I think that in that context, I mean, as I said earlier, there's enough room for everybody in Brooklyn.
And I would just mention that we featured another Center for an Urban Future report a couple of segments ago on breaking into the corporate supply chain, which actually talked about ways in which small local businesses can work with sort of national chains to sort of break into that supply chain and the like. Gentlemen, I thank you both for being here. This is a wonderful study. It's important information, and I'm grateful that we were able to talk about it here on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Become a fan on Facebook, like Brooklyn Independent Television.